Good evening. Welcome to the Lessons of Vietnam. I'm your host, Bill Dixon. Tonight's show is going to be those who also served. What I'd like for you to do is, I know you're going to get interested in the show and forget to do this, but I want you to go ahead and think about it now and get it done. Is now 919 518 9773 and talk to our guest or make comments. Even better, go to your computer and go to Computers 2K, that's K as in kilo, voice on Skype. And you can see the show and also make comments and so forth and join us in the show. Tonight we have two guests, both guests who served in the military, served during the Vietnam War. They did not go to Vietnam, but they served the troops coming home from Vietnam. Let me ask you a question. Has anyone ever heard of a World War One era veteran, a World War II era veteran, or how about a Korean era veteran? Why do we have two different Vietnam veterans? We have the Vietnam veterans and we have Vietnam era veterans. I've never really quite understood. The Vietnam veterans, ones who we used to say who boots on the ground, but you've got a lot of people who served on the ships off the coast of Vietnam who are considered Vietnam veterans, and they didn't put boots on the ground, but they're considered Vietnam veterans. And then the Vietnam era veterans served wherever the Uncle Sam decided to send them. Right at 3 million people, men and women, served in country in Vietnam during the war, the 10 years or so of the war. But 9 million people served this country during that same period of time. Only one third of them went to Vietnam. Now, it was, why did some people go and others didn't go? That's hard to go by. It was sometimes luck of the jaw, what kind of job you had. Sometimes you had jobs that were more useful here than over in Vietnam. Whatever expertise was, sometimes it was political. If your daddy had plenty of money and he was willing to talk to his congressman and promise some campaigning money or whatever, you could probably get out of it. But a good portion of everybody who served in Vietnam were volunteers to be there. But all the veterans who served. Now, in 1966 and 69, the troops who were serving in in Korea, which if I had my choice, I'd much rather go to Vietnam. I just don't do 40 degrees below zero. I asked a guy today how he took a leak at 40 degrees below zero. He said very carefully, if you can find it. So in 1966, there was an ambush of American soldiers, and it was called the Second Korean War from 1966-69. Now, those guys were in combat in Korea during that 3-year period of time. Would you call them Vietnam era veterans? They weren't Vietnam veterans, but they were in combat. I quite can't find anybody who can tell me exactly where that came from. We all served. I joined the Army not to go to Vietnam, and didn't help me out a whole lot. I was supposed to go to Germany, and that's another story. So, but you had a lot of people, 2/3 of everybody who served in the military served around the country, around the world. As you know, we've got troops everywhere, and quite often they were in harm's way and so forth. Tonight's show is the story of two people who served their country with honor and took care of those American troops that served in Vietnam that came home. Our first guest tonight is Brenda Brubaker. Brenda is very active with the Vietnam Veterans of America 530 chapter out of Durham. Brenda, where are you from?
Originally, I was born and raised in Minnesota and lived for a while in Pennsylvania, and now I'm from Durham, North Carolina.
Okay. What did you do when you got out of high school? What did you do?
When I got out of high school, I went into nursing school at St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. It was kind of an unusual time to be on campus. I was a student on campus when Kent State and Jackson State issues occurred with the National Guard and the students. It was a time of moratorium. The campus was closed down for a period of time. One's allegiances were questioned. One's awareness of Vietnam suddenly popped up. It was an unusual time to be on campus. And then suddenly I realized I wanted to be a nurse and I wanted to stay on that campus, and I had no more money to do so. And the military came knocking on my door saying, "We want nurses. We do not have enough nurses to serve the people that are coming back from Vietnam and from other places in the world." And so they offered me a scholarship to finish school, to pay a salary, to enlist me in either the Navy or the Army. I was accepted in both the Navy and the Army, and I liked the Navy uniform better. So it was a matter of money, and I decided to take that money and join the Navy. They paid for my last year of school, and I owed them 3 years beyond that.
That was interesting. Doing all that stuff that was going on, that you must really want to go to finish school to go with all the protests and anti-military. It wasn't just an anti-war; it was anti-military to actually stand up and go, "Well, I think I'll go in the Navy or the Army or whatever." You didn't. There was no affiliation while you were on campus with the military. That you didn't have a uniform or anything that you had to wear.
We were not allowed to wear uniforms. It was not safe to wear uniforms.
Okay.
We had ROTC on campus, and they were given orders no longer to wear uniforms. So it wasn't a safe time. Student nurses were also trained in handling things like tear gas. We were asked to volunteer at peace marches. We were asked to volunteer at National Guard events. And in doing that, you suddenly realize that here are a group of people that are advocating for peace by using destructive, harmful methods, hurting individuals, damaging property. It just didn't seem right that there was that kind of disconnect. It was also a time when we were going from a standard draft to a lottery, and I really had trouble resolving how you could draft some people and not draft others, and being on campus watching everybody burn their draft cards, along with women throwing their bras in the pile at the same time. So, there were all these things going on. And so I didn't tell anybody that I'd joined the Navy. I didn't tell them that I was going to training until after I had left the campus.
Did you ever, as you were getting close to graduating, did you have second thoughts going, now, I'm not certain that I did the right thing?
Well, I was lucky. They had paid a salary while I was in school, so I bought a car for cash. I had a job. Most of my classmates did not have a job. I was guaranteed a job. I knew where I was going. I knew where I was going to be stationed. So, that was kind of more security than a lot of people had.
So now you've got out of school, and you're now officially in the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine it was hard for people, and it still is. We forget sometimes that women do serve. To get recognized for your service, because you're a woman. People always think it's the guy or whatever. How did that work as far as just getting started in the Navy and being?
Well, I was really lucky. I finished school in December, and it's not a typical time for the military to bring personnel onto active duty. So there was a very small group of us, all nurses. We went to Newport to have our indoctrination into how to be good Navy officers. And so there were only 47 of us, so it was kind of a close-knit group. All of us objected to marching. All of us objected to military uniforms, to spit-shining shoes, to having to swim and all those kinds of things. But we were, a group together. So we didn't face any of the things that larger groups faced. I didn't face issues, and even serving, I didn't face real issues. It was getting out that I ran into problems with being a female veteran.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So did they basically taught you how to salute and who to salute and that sort of stuff?
Yes, and some rather useless kinds of things like being able to identify the shadows of ships or airplanes and be able to identify what they were. And I can't understand why nurses needed to know that, but that's part of the training that we went through. Jumping off of a high dock into water, so we knew what it was like to jump off of a ship, and then you had to swim underwater to avoid the oil slicks. So we got the basic ship training as well.
Okay, so you got some of the basic training that a guy who was on the ships and so forth. Because I would say that the nurses. Now, were nurses on battleships and so forth during that period of time?
The only ships that nurses were on during Vietnam were the two hospital ships, the Sanctuary and the Repose. Yeah. Other than that, occasionally a nurse was assigned to a ship just long enough to get from one port to another, but the only duty stations were those two ships. Now, there were 4 Navy nurses that came to Vietnam and established the first hospital, military hospital in Vietnam, and that was, of course, for serving the Marines. And these 4 were the first 4 women to get Purple Hearts during the whole Vietnam era.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you got through being, we'll call it basic training, what did they do with you then?
I got shipped to South Philadelphia. They gave me one of my first 3 choices.
A hazardous duty place.
Yeah, it was the war zone of South Philadelphia. Yeah. They gave me 3 choices, and I got my 4th one. And I stayed in Philadelphia with temporary duty to a number of different places, but basically stayed in Philadelphia for almost 4 years. Spent the first a couple of weeks just re-establishing typical nursing techniques, and then got to go and meet the charge nurse or chief nurse of the hospital at that time, and that happened to be Maxine Condor, who became a rear admiral, the 2nd rear admiral in the Navy for women. And she took one look at me and said, well, you know, we don't really have places for you right now, so we've got a nurse that's sick, so you go ahead and go and work on the male urology unit. A lot of the injuries in Vietnam involved spinal cord injuries and head injuries, which meant that the lower half of the male anatomy wasn't working correctly. And we tried to reestablish bladder patterns by inserting catheters every 2 hours into these young men. And I was a rather naive nurse, and so she put me in the last place on the planet I probably should have been working, but showing up and being told that I had to catheterize all 60 young men, all under the age of 24, all in an open unit, was a real experience for a young nurse. The first thing I did was call, hey, Corpsman. And I was told, the Corpsman's busy, you need to learn how to do this. So a very nice, old, crusty chief who, in hindsight, was probably not over 40, but to a 22-year-old, he looked like a crusty chief, showed me how to do it, and had me do it all the way around. So I survived that.
And the patients did.
And the patients did.
So you were at Philadelphia. They had a lot of Vietnam wounded coming in and so forth.
You know, a lot of people have seen MASH on TV, think that military medicine is all MASH. What happens when they're done at MASH and they leave that hospital? Where do they go? A lot of the misconception is they go to the VA. But there's a long period of time between leaving that field hospital or the in-country hospital and they're actually being able to go home or go to the VA. So where did the Aerovac end? The Aerovac ended on the East Coast for the Marines and the Navy at Philadelphia Naval Hospital. On the West Coast, it was San Diego. So we would get a notice that the Aerovac is coming in today, and we would get 30, 40, 100, 300 patients at a time that the Air Force had gone around the world collecting from the various places. We would get men off of the field who had been stabilized at a hospital in Vietnam, who stopped for triage at Yokosuka or Taipei or maybe Rota, Spain, and only enough to get their IVs restarted to make sure they were stable enough to make the flight overseas and return to us in South Philadelphia. So we got people, you know, basically 48 hours off the battlefield. Their dressings all had to come off, their IVs all had to be restarted. A lot of the amputees needed revisions of their amputations. So we got a lot of battlefield injuries, a lot of things that people just don't realize.
Yeah. Um, as a 22-year-old nurse, that had to be pretty traumatic to see the kind of wounds. It's not like you see in the movies where somebody gets shot in the arm and go, "Oh, I've been shot in the arm," and keep going. The bullets, shrapnel, and bombs really make a really mess of the body, and had to be with the trauma. And I would think that quite often the guys the wounded were almost in shock until they got by that time. By the time they got to you, they're probably coming out of shock, and then they go back into shock again when they realize just to the point that they've been wounded and how seriously they've been wounded. Or
By the time they came to us, they were so full of drugs, they didn't know where they were, what was happening, or what had happened to them. They put them on enough drugs so that they wouldn't wake up through the whole AirVac system.
mm-hmm.
So we were waking them up. A lot of times we were the first person that had to explain to them that they were missing a leg or an arm, or that they couldn't roll over because their body wouldn't roll over for them. We had to explain to them that the buddy that they were initially shipped with didn't make it overseas. So, it was a lot of, you just hardened yourself very much, just like the nurses in Vietnam had to. We had to too. It wasn't an easy time, but you learned to just kind of deal with it. And when you're getting 30 or 40 people that are that seriously injured, you don't worry about it anymore. You just, I don't know, suck it up and take care of them.
I've worked in the emergency room, and you get to the point you don't have time to think other than what you're doing. There's not a whole lot going on around you because you're just so concentrated on what you're doing and so forth. But I can't imagine anywhere from 30 to a couple hundred coming in at one time.
We had awesome corpsmen, though. You think in this country of nurses is the nurses are doing the work and the nursing assistants just kind of help. Our corpsmen were nurses. They had nursing training. They just didn't have all the other education.
Mm-hmm.
So, they were incredible individuals. They could triage patients like you wouldn't believe. You have 30 amputees coming onto a unit at one time, all of whom had to be redressed, all of whom had to be triaged, and they did the triage. So the nurses pretty much did supervision. So that was, awesome group of individuals we had.
Well, I imagine the nurses had to do things that normally a doctor would have to do. Y'all had to.
Yeah, there were things that didn't fall underneath my license to be a nurse that we did, but we don't talk publicly about that.
Yeah. I've been there, done that.
Yeah.
Tell us how long were you there?
Well, I told you I spent the 2 weeks in urology, and they decided that wasn't the best place for me to be. And then I spent a month in orthopedics, covering for another nurse, and she came back. So then they put me in dependence medicine, which was the wrong place on earth for me to be, taking care of a group of whiny, snivelly captain and admiral's wives. Just wasn't a happy situation. But I did my full 6 months of medicine, and then I transferred where I really wanted to be, which was mental health or psychiatry. And so I spent 2.5 years then working on the psych wards there.
Well, working with the wife of an admiral who thought she was an admiral, that should have been mental health too.
Well, the admirals' wives, they were quite the cases, which was really funny because the admirals were all humble, wonderful individuals who loved their staff, who loved the personnel. But the wives, on the other hand, they were something else.
Yeah.
But it was good. It was good. I wanted to work psych, so I really liked going there. Now, I moved into the psych area about the time that the POWs were coming back from Vietnam. So, we're talking early to mid 73.
Mm-hmm.
And the POW situation was kind of unique because they cleared off one of the officers' floors for the POWs to be on, and we kind of had our own POW encampment. In other words, they were not allowed to leave the floor. We were not allowed to talk to them. If we saw them in the hallway, we couldn't ask them questions, couldn't speak to them. They needed to be debriefed, they needed to be evaluated. They'd already gone through these kinds of things in Germany and in Yokosuka. So coming to us, they'd already been through that, and we weren't supposed to do anything with them, just kind of ignore them. Only certain people could work. We were told what kind of questions, if we worked with them, what kind of questions we could ask, what kind of questions we couldn't ask, where they could be. Finally, they agreed that their families could come visit, but they could only visit with their families in certain places at certain times, and we shouldn't be near them during that time. And it was really funny because they needed night coverage for a nurse, and I was the junior nurse around. So guess who got to cover the POW unit for a week worth of nights? But I wasn't allowed to ask the questions. I wasn't, allowed to interact with them. So it was really kind of funny. And, there are funny stories that come out of that because, the POWs were used to being locked up in strange countries under strange circumstances, and you put them in a Navy hospital, and you tell me how likely we really were to lock them onto that unit.
Yeah.
So I got there, and about 10 o'clock at night, they all left to go to the bar down the street. And of course, being a good Navy nurse, I'm like, well, they can't leave. They're supposed to be locked in this unit. And I was told to shut up and mind my own business. So, I learned a little bit of humility in helping to manage that. And when they came back, I learned that it really didn't matter what we were told to talk to them about or not talk to them about, that they were human beings just like the rest of us. They weren't that much older than we were. They'd just been through hell. And that was a real learning experience, too.
Yeah, I imagine they had the attitude, what are they going to do, send me to Vietnam?
Yeah.
And what much they could do. And after you've been 5-6 years or more locked up in the way they were, I don't want a whole lot the Navy could do to them. And I'm surprised that they even come back in at nights and so forth, or the family. And you probably couldn't answer a lot of questions either if they ask you a question.
Well, a lot of things we didn't know. A lot of the material that they had was supposedly classified, but we wouldn't know if something was classified or not. So, they were just human beings like anybody else.
Well, the world had definitely changed while they were away.
Yeah, you should see them when they got new shoes or new shirts or stuff like that. See them when they clothing had changed or new shirts or stuff like that. So clothing had changed during that time. It was just a stuff like that. So a whole re-education. During that time, it was just a.
So you were there with them for a while. What did you do after that?
Well, most of the time I spent on the neuropsychiatric unit.
I'm going to interrupt you. That was a period of time that they hadn't recognized post-traumatic stress or any of that stuff, and you were dealing with, I would think you were dealing with soldiers who were having problems but didn't understand why they were having problems, and you had a government that didn't understand why they were having problems. How were you able to help them? Or
well, we had a number of different categories of patients. The age of 19 to 22 is typically, if you're going to be schizophrenic or you're going to be a manic depressive, when you have your first psychotic break. So we had people who were in very stressful situations who would have their first psychotic break in the military, and they would come to be with us for a period of time. We were also starting to go through the drawback of forces in Vietnam. And then the end of 73, we pretty much cleared out. And so we had a group of people that were very good soldiers, very good Marines, and suddenly didn't have jobs to be very good Marines. And so they were getting into all sorts of trouble. So they were considered antisocial people, and they would come to us. And then you had the people that were suffering from what they called war neurosis, or they were starting to use PTSD within the military. It just wasn't a common term used outside of the military at that time. So we had quite a conglomeration of individuals. Orthopedics were starting to cut down on the number because there were fewer casualties, but there were greater numbers of mental health patients. In a hospital that had a capacity of 600 people, we ran about 300 or 400 mental health patients at any one time. And then gradually, up till about 76, that number cut down to about 100.
Yeah, the thing about it to me would be that all this was coming about, and there really wasn't a treatment per se. It was just kind of I would think it would be we do almost the same treatment for everybody. I mean, there was how much treatment or training did y'all get as far as combat fatigue or whatever they wanted to call it?
The Navy required that nurses going to work in psych take a week-long Learn to be a Mental Health Nurse course. And so that was helpful because the instructors of that course were nurses who'd been working in psych who understood some of the issues. But a lot of it was just OJT. We gave a lot of Thorazine, we gave a lot of Haldol, we had a lot of what we called takedowns. Actually, somebody was just so out of control, we'd lay them down on the floor and give them an injection. We were dealing with symptoms, we weren't really dealing with the problem. And one of the things that we were trying to help patients understand too is you can't talk about these things when you go home. So talk about them when you're here with us. But you don't want to go out in the street and talk about what it was like in Vietnam. You don't want to tell your family this. All these things that we're now telling people you should be talking about, we were telling our patients learn not to talk about them. We're trying to re-socialize them so that they could go out and get jobs. Because if anybody made it to the Naval Hospital for mental health, they weren't going back onto active duty. So, it was trying to help them make the transition. Most of our patients were there 6 months, 8 months, a year. A lot of our patients had come in as young individuals, had had an issue in Vietnam. They weren't there for their full 6 months. So if we didn't keep them up until their 181st day, they weren't going to get VA care. They were going to have to go out and get their own care. So we would lose papers. We would say that there was something else going on with them, so they would have to have more testing. We even had people from the reserve have a psychotic break, and they were only on a 2-week training. And we would see if we couldn't arrange to have them there for their 180 days so that they could get their full VA benefits. Of course, our doctors, the psychiatrists, most of them were drafted. Most of them, were kind of like, what's the Navy going to do? Fire us? They need us far more than we need to be here. So the military rules weren't that strong for them. They were more concerned about taking care of their patients.
Yeah. I would imagine you had a lot of people who needed the service but knew their career was over with if they did seek it out, because that stigma back then was you're out of the service pretty much.
The officers, that was certainly true, but the enlisted people didn't have much choice. They got orders. Their orders read South Philadelphia Naval Hospital, and they were there until they got new orders cut. So we've had guys that would be there 2 weeks and they'd be fine to go out. So they would get a billet at the shipyard, so that they would have a job there, but technically they were still our patients, and they would be there for that, however long their orders were there. And sometimes it took that 6 months to cut a new set of orders for them. We had a lot of acting out, but we had wonderful psych techs. All of our corpsmen were either psych techs or psych techs in training. So they had, beyond the core school training, they also had psychiatric training. So they were my nurses. If I was working evenings or I was working nights, I was the only nurse for 7 or 8 full military psychiatric units. So the corpsmen ran those units.
Now, what was the rank vernacular for a officer nurse? In the Army, it'd be a lieutenant, but
I started out as an ensign. Back in the urology unit, I was the ensign back there. After 6 months, of course, I'd spent as an ensign in college too. The last 6 months of my college were as an ensign, so I'd had that. So after 6 months, I became a JG and got out as a full lieutenant, which would be the same thing as a captain in the Army.
Now, were you in Philadelphia your entire tour of duty, or?
I had temporary duty for a couple of weeks, and I don't even remember why, but to Bethesda, which was a whole different country with all of the dignitaries and that kind of thing. I spent a couple of weeks at Bainbridge, and Bainbridge was in the process of cutting way down. They had cut out the women's program there. They were cutting back, and so I was just covering in a dispensary for a nurse that had gone on leave for a couple of weeks. So I had a couple of temporary duties like that, but most of my time was at South Philadelphia.
Now, when you got out, I guess after that you got out of the Navy.
I did.
What did you do then?
I went to work in public mental. Well, let me step back once.
Okay.
When you get out of the military and you're a Vietnam vet, whether you're an era vet or a in-country vet, we faced all of the same issues.
Yes, if you wore a uniform, you were a weird person, and people shunned you, and you were supposed to be crazy. And
I went to my first job. They were desperate need of nurses, especially mental health nurses, and I gave them my DD 214 because I was told when I got out that I should give my DD 214 and I'd get military preference. And the lady took one look at it, looked at me, and said, "We don't hire your kind." And I'm going, "Okay, what is my kind?" And she said, "You're a Vietnam veteran." And I said, "Well, I was never in Vietnam." And she said, "You don't get it. You were in the military. We don't hire your kind. Go to the hospital across town." So I went to the hospital across town. And I had an interview there, and they said, "Well, we're not looking for mental health nurses." So I took out the ad that said that they needed 8 new nurses. And I said, "Well, what about this?" And they said, "Well, just a minute." And they called in the nun that was in charge of that area. And she talked to me for a few minutes. She went back to them and she said, "I'm going to take a chance on her." And so she was the one that hired me on a chance. And so I worked there for about 3.5 years and found out I was pregnant and decided to quit that job. And my husband and I were on vacation, traveling through North Carolina, found a job for him. We transferred to Durham, North Carolina, and I got a job at the VA in Durham. We've been in Durham ever since then.
Yeah, let me back up just a little bit here. While you were in Philadelphia in the hospital, you met a corpsman that you kind of liked or something. How did that?
Well, I was working nights. I had my turn at nights, and I walked onto a unit, and there was a new corpsman. He had just come from psych training at Bethesda, and he said he'd been at Lejeune before that, in various units at Lejeune with the Marines, and he was there starting to work on one of my units. And so I asked him a little bit about him, and we started talking, and before long we were dating, and then we ended up getting married. So I was his boss, and I've been bossing him ever since.
Yeah.
But now in the military, an officer marrying an enlisted, I would have been court-martialed.
Yeah.
But at that point, I had a very wise commander who said, "Go and talk to the chief nurse, get an appointment with the commanding officer, and ask the commanding officer's permission to get married." So I did that and got the CO's blessing, and that's all that it took. Of course, we got split up. We got on different units and that kind of thing, but otherwise it worked out fine.
Yeah. So now you're back here in North Carolina. I know, I've known you for a while. I know you were very involved in veterans issues. Probably one of the people who are most up to date on what's going on and so forth with the VA and medical issues and so forth. Tell us a little bit about, and I know you've been an advocate for women veterans because they're kind of like the Korean veterans. They're the forgotten soldiers. Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing as far as local in the community and so forth, and whatever you want to tell us about fighting for women veterans' rights.
When I first started working at the VA, I decided I was going to see what benefits I had. I can get a VA loan for the house, which I have done, and I can get burial rights. But because I was employable, because I could get insurance, I was not eligible for any other health care benefits or anything like that. I'd had a dental waiver and I was supposed to get dental benefits, and the VA said, we don't provide them here. So dental was out for me then too. So, I just worked at the VA for a while. Loved working at the VA, loved taking care of the veterans. When a veteran sits down with a veteran, especially in mental health, there's just a special bond that other people just don't understand. There's nothing they could tell me that I hadn't already heard or hadn't already seen before. You understand the combat issues that they've been in. Um, a Navy SEAL would come and go, but I can't tell you where I've been. And I go, I know that. Oh, I can't tell you what I've done. Well, I know that. Everybody else was like, well, you need to talk about it. So, there's just a special kind of a bond that occurs with that. When I stopped working at the VA, I started working. I worked for a while in industry. I worked for a while as a high school teacher. Then I found community college system and have been working as a clinical instructor in a nursing program. And you have all these opportunities to teach people how to deal with veterans, how to accept veterans, how veterans are no different than anybody else. We've just experienced something that other people haven't experienced. My first physical at the VA, they didn't have a space for women to have physicals. So in the open space where men were having physicals, they just had two people stand up with sheets and hold sheets up on either side of you so that they could do your physical exam. There were no beds for women. Most of the units at the VA at that time were still open wards. There were very few private rooms. So there were no places for women to be served there. So we've come a long way. Durham has an awesome women's program. They've got wonderful nurse practitioners and everything working in that program now. So we're leading the country as far as serving veterans. We've come a long way with that. But, we've got a long way to go. Sometimes I sit back and I go, why do I do this? Why do I want to help veterans? And you just realize it's because it's the right thing to do. Nobody really understands under the age of 25 what it means to be at war unless they've been in the military. They don't understand that we are at war. They're very good at telling somebody. I kind of like the joke when, well, thank you for your service. And the guy turns around and goes, well, I'm not your waiter. And it kind of seems like that kind of response from public, thank you for your service. What does that mean? There's so much more to it. We've got to get the veterans their benefits. If they, they've earned it, they deserve it. We've got to get it to them. So any way we can do that, getting involved with our legislature. All of you go out and vote. Please go out and vote. I'm not going to tell you which way to vote, but vote your conscience. Be involved. Let your legislators know. If teachers in this state have a problem with something, they email their legislators. They're at the legislative house. They're really involved. If the people down east that want the waters protected for their minnows have a problem, they let their legislators know. If veterans have issues, they sit at home and fuss and whine about it. They don't let their legislators know. So please flood your legislators' emails. Please call their offices. Please go and see them. Let them know what your issues are as being a veteran. It's so important.
I think the legislator and a lot of people don't realize that the issues between an active duty soldier and a veteran are different. And sometimes we say that we're a military state. I guess we are with the active duty people we have, but they seem to forget the veteran, especially as they older to get, the Korean veterans and so forth. So I think they have a tendency, the legislature will always talk about what we can do for the active duty soldiers and sometimes forget the thing. What has it been like to be a veteran, which as a woman, it's hard for people to even think that you've been a veteran, but being a veteran during the Vietnam War, and they divided up, somebody decided there was a a Vietnam veteran, a Vietnam era veteran, it's almost like uh, there's a higher pecking order there. What's
It, it it makes me really angry sometimes when somebody thinks that my service wasn't as of great a value as their service, or I didn't do things as good as they did them, or I wasn't as good a military person as they were. It, they really try to demean somebody that's an era veteran. So that really gets my ire up sometimes. That we were waiting at home. We weren't waiting at home. We were, to use modern terms, we were deployed just like they were. We were in a strange place with strange people under strange circumstances. And a lot of times we saw in this country more of the damages done by war than a lot of people in country were actually seeing. We got to see mass casualties. We got to take care of mass casualties. We got the end result of that. We got to take care of them. We got to do the rehab. We got to put limbs on them. We got to explain to their wives and spouses why they were never going to be the same way. We got that whole end result. And that's not as good as being someplace else. That's really hard to take.
is there anything else? I want to get Sam on before we run out of time. So, is there anything else you want to tell us, or your story that you feel like you need to tell us, or
Oh, there are lots of things, but that's for another time.
okay, all right. Well, I appreciate you being here and telling you your part of the story. It was awesome to hear it and see it from your perspective, especially with all the trauma and so forth you saw. So, what we're going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about a holiday coming up, and while Sam and Brenda switches off. And again, Brenda, thank you for being here, and looking forward to talking to Sam. What I want to do is go into Veterans Day is coming up, and wherever you are, I hope you can attend the Veterans Day parade. A lot of people get mixed up between Memorial Day and Veterans Day. Let me tell you a little bit about the differences and so forth. Memorial Day is when we recognize those who paid the ultimate price, those that have died as a result of their service. Veterans Day, we remember those people, but we also remember those who put their life on the line, left their families, and also served. So that's the difference between the two. While those who died are remembered as veterans, but veterans, as I said, cares everybody. They have different histories. Next one. The first official observance of Memorial Day was May 28, 1868. That was long about the time of the war, the Northern Aggression. Some people call it the Civil War. When flowers were placed on the graves of Union Confederate soldiers at Arlington National Cemetery. And the reason that Arlington National Cemetery became a national cemetery is because that was the scene of the Curtis Lee Mansion, Robert E. Lee's wife's family home, and they wanted to make sure that Robert E. Lee could never go back to his home, so they turned it into Arlington National Cemetery. They had a big ceremony there. After World War I, the holiday was extended to all soldiers who had fallen in all of the wars. Up until that time, they had the Civil War, and then after World War I, they made it for the Great War. And when it ended on June 28, 1999, at the Palace of Versailles, outside of Versailles, France, the fighting had ceased because of an armistice. And they called it November 11th, 1918, is generally regarded as the end of the war to end all wars. How did that work for us? The armistice was signed on the 11th day of the 11th month at 11 o'clock. And that's the reason November 11th was considered a holiday. In November 1919, President Wilson proclaimed November 11th as the first commemorative of Armistice Day with the following words. To quote, "To us in America, the reflections of Armistice Day will be filled with solemn pride in the heroism of those who died in the country's service and with gratitude for the victory, both because of the things from which it has freed us and because of the opportunity it has given America to show her sympathy with peace and justice in the councils of the nation." The original concept for the celebration was for a day observed with parades and a brief suspension of business beginning at 11 o'clock. That's why a lot of ceremonies are starting at 11:11. Then the Congress officially recognized the end of World War I when it passed a concurrent resolution in June 4th, 1926. An act approved May 13th, 1938 made the 11th day of each year a legal holiday, dedicated to the cause of world peace, and thereafter celebrated as known as Armistice Day. And in June 1954, November 11th became a day to honor American veterans of war. So it became, that's when it became Veterans Day rather than Armistice Day, because it covered in all veterans and so forth. And then the government decided that, why don't we make Veterans Day on one of those Mondays to give us long weekends? So they changed Veterans Day to whatever date Monday closest to Veterans Day, whatever date that Monday would be, so that the bureaucrats in Washington could have an extra long weekend. But a lot of the states didn't go along with that. Everybody got confused when Veterans Day and so forth. So they changed it back October 25th, 1971. They changed it back. Actually, it was 1975. Gerald Ford signed a public law returning the annual observance of Veterans Day to its original date of November 11th, beginning in 1978. So it was a real confusion there for a while. The National Day of Veterans Day cemetery, big ceremony is still held at Arlington Cemetery, starting at the wreath. I said leaf, but I have a wreath laying. I know I can say that word at 11 o'clock. And so wherever you are, try to take a few moments at least to remember those veterans who put their life on the line, wrote that check, as they say, to celebrate Veterans Day. And also, if you are a veteran, I just want to let you know that this year, what's the steakhouse? Golden Corral's serving veterans on November 14th. That's the day. If you're a veteran, you get a free meal there. And a lot of other restaurants in the area also serving free meals, Veterans Day and so forth. So if you're a veteran, go out there and wear your hat, or your shirts, or whatever it is. Let everybody know you're a veteran. Be proud of it. And go get your free meal and so forth. Now I want to talk to our next guest, Sam Brubaker. Sam has been the president of Vietnam Veterans of America, Post 530 in Durham for how many years?
10.
About 10 years. And if it hadn't been for Sam, I believe the whole organization would have dried up and gone away. Sam and Brenda both. And that's where I met them. And Sam, we already know that you were a corpsman.
Yes.
Where were you grew up at?
My home state is Pennsylvania, town of Lebanon, and graduated high school. My folks informed me that they didn't have the monies to send me to college, so I was talked into enlisting into the military. And that talking came from, of all things, my mother, who had divorced my biological father and remarried a master gunnery sergeant for the Marine Corps. And he had also been a local recruiter in town. And, of course, I was pretty much destined for the Marines. And he said, well, actually asked me one day, he said, what do you think you would like to do in the military? And I said, well, I'd like to get involved in medical corps of some kind. And he said, well, you'll need to enlist in the Navy because the Marines get their medical corps from the Navy. And I went and talked to the recruiter and took all the tests. And I graduated high school in 71. And 3 months later, in August, I was headed for boot camp in Great Lakes, Illinois.
For those that didn't, maybe not quite heard, the Marine Corps does not have their own corpsman. They use since they are a part of the Navy, they use the Navy corpsman. So you could become a Navy corpsman and all of a sudden be out with the Marines in the mud and so forth, as the mud Marines and so forth. So it's kind of the luck of the draw where you are when they start doing that. Now, where did you go what kind of training did you get as to be a corpsman, and where did you go, and so forth?
Well, after going through regular Navy boot camp in Great Lakes, Illinois, then I was already guaranteed to be a hospital corpsman. Uh, so I went, except from being in boot camp to a couple of weeks at home to going back to Great Lakes to the Naval Hospital there for Corps training. And I was there for uh, all through those 3 to 4 months. And I was getting close to graduating, and I put in a request to go to Fleet Marines. I said, "This is what I want to do," and that's somebody said, "Well, just give it a shot." So I did that, and the request came back denied. They said that they weren't going to be taking any new corpsmen fresh out of school to assign them to a Marine unit. So that was kind of my first feeling of dejection. Uh, but then I graduated from Corps school, and they then said, they give you this wish list that fill this out where you'd like to go. And I'm going, oh, this has got to have a catch to it. But I put down like Corpus Christi, Texas. I put Australia, and just on a whim, because I'd been there one time, I put down Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, at the Naval Hospital there. And when the assignments came out, bingo, Camp Lejeune. I said, "Oh, that's sweet. I'll be down there. I'll be as close to the Marines as I can be." I showed up down there in the spring, or close to summer of '72, and started working on, of all things, orthopedics floor, and got to see a lot of the troops, such coming back from Vietnam. A lot of them, of the guys and gals we were servicing, were also those that were local at Camp Lejeune or at one of the other neighboring camps, and so we had a real great cross section of training of different things orthopedic wise, and then I put in a request to uh, go and work in neurology and psychiatry, and got transferred up to that unit, and got to work with some of those individuals that had failed out of Paris Island, and were now having some issues, and were being taken care of on the psychiatric ward. And some of the weekends I would work the emergency room, and would get to see all kinds of folks come through the door, from gunshot wounds to some of our troops being transported in, and they needed to be evaluated, triaged, and then sent on to one of the whatever floor they needed to go to for their treatment.
Sounds like it's a
So
lot of on-the-job training.
a lot of it was, but I was learning all about psychiatry, and then I moved over to neurology, and that was quite a bit different in that, we dealt with a lot of alcoholics and uh, men that were having difficulties adjusting to being back home. Went on from uh, I while I was at Lejeune, then I decided to put in another request to go to Fleet Marines. I said, how can they say no? I'm right here. And they came back and said, no, we're not taking any corpsmen right now. I said, okay, I'll work through this. And another month or two later, I decided, well, I'm going to go on to the specialty school, neuropsychiatry. And I told them I'd be happy to go to San Diego. I'll pay my own way. And they said, no, we're going to billet you in at Bethesda Naval Hospital. I said, well, that even gets me closer to home. So I went through the technician training there. And of all things, they took the whole group of us and sent us to the Philadelphia Naval Hospital uh, where we helped supplant what they needed in order to help with dealing with all the troops that were coming back from Vietnam and from those that were dealing with issues since they returned and things. So, and of course, you already heard the part about the meeting up with a Navy nurse, and we just did things by the book. And I was the first one to leave the service in October of '75. They offered absolutely nothing except a guarantee of either overseas or on the seas. And I said, well, maybe this is my shot at getting overseas. And they said, I said, well, what can I be? Is there any other guarantees? They said none. And I said, well, I think I'll just take my 4 years and 3 months of active duty and head out of the service. And enlisted in colleges, got accepted at a college up in Erie, Pennsylvania, and then waited until my wife got her discharge from the Navy, and then we all met up in a new location and continued our family life from there.
Yeah. Well, let me ask somewhat the same thing I asked Brenda earlier. Here you are, you served, and that was had to be a tough job. You served, and you were probably treated just like the guy returning from Vietnam because you were a veteran. Hard to get jobs. People kind of looked at you strange and so forth. But you, as a veteran, how was it like to? I know when we came home, we were told not to wear our uniform. How was it for
Right.
you?
Yeah, you basically kind of wore your civilian clothes into, the Naval Hospital, and then you would change into uh, the dress for the day, and then when you went home, you would change back into civilian clothes because you just didn't want to be seen in your military uniform out in South Philly or Central Philly,
Mm-hmm.
things like that, because you just didn't want to have to deal with the angst that you would get from folks that just didn't realize what the issues were, and some of the problems that we were picking up on. I mean, it was just I believe too that the things that we did in order to take care of the troops coming back and those that were needing our help that that never went over there and were stateside, that we did provide a service. And it bothered me a little bit to be called an era veteran, but then I'm thinking, I do understand the sacrifices and all the supreme injustices that everybody went through, that were boots on the ground over there. And I kind of wear the era badge, with a bit of pride, because I'm still denoted as being someone who served during the Vietnam era. So I think we're all era veterans. It's just that some of us, did the ultimate. They were on the firing lines, and and fighting for our freedom. So, my hat's off to all those men and women that put their self in harm's way.
Well, I think most of us who served in country, who would go back, and most of us would go back and serve again. But would like to have stayed home also and worked. I think it's important to Vietnam veterans, in country Vietnam veterans, to realize that we all served. You got people. You didn't go to Canada. You didn't burn your graft chart. You served and you supported the wounded Vietnam veteran as much as anybody else in country, as Brenda said a while ago. So I think it's a veteran is a veteran. We all went through the same thing. We came home. You couldn't tell people you were a Vietnam vet. The American Legions and the VFWs didn't want anything to do with us. And I think it's important to remember that we're all veterans. We were all, as you said, Vietnam era veterans. We were also Cold War veterans. All of us kind of grumped into there. So I think it's important as Veteran Day comes up that we remember all of our veterans, and along with the veterans, the families that they left behind to go serve, whether it was in Camp Lejeune, and if you were from Pennsylvania like you were, it's not something you can get home for the holidays or whatever necessary, or whether in Korea, which is still at war, or wherever around the world, that we all serve and we all sacrifice certain things in part of our life, and Christmas, and you kind of put your life on a hold for a while when you're in the military, while your friends will go on and go to college and come out and get these nice jobs and so forth. And the military is not known for its high pay, but you put your life on hold just to serve your country. And I think everybody needs to recognize that a veteran is a veteran. Appreciate y'all tuning in. I'm working on another show that I've got a Navy medic who worked in the Marines in Vietnam coming
Excellent.
on. I've got another man who's with the North Carolina History Museum who is trying to get some things for the museum. So again, thank you for tuning in, and enjoy Veterans Day. Go to a parade or whatever. Good night.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. Our weekly lineup of call-in programs includes Computers 2K Now with Amnon Nissan, My Life, My Will with Gisela DiCarlo, The Tanya Love Show, Health Then with Debbie Bruck, Breaking Free with Marilyn Shannon, Triangle Be Well with Howard Jacobson, Lunch and Learn with Rabbi Yisrael Cutler, Lessons of Vietnam with NCVVI members, Current Affairs with Amnon Nissan. And if you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section on nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Atomos.com, makers of quality video recorders and converters, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.